Hello and welcome to this week's writing Q&A video. This week's question is from another penguin. And the question is, what if your plot at times feels too challenging to write? There's many ideas, characters, events, but it's a lot of information to keep track of. How do I know when I've hit my limit? So I always like to say that, writing a novel is a very complex art form. And mostly this is because it involves mastering multiple different skill sets. And some of those are practical, but many of them are just part of the actual theory and technique of writing. And then you have to use all of them in the novel at the same time. And it is a lot to keep track of. I mean, on the one hand, you've got like research and notes of that sort, but also just keeping track in your head of the structural beats, of where you want to go with the theme, of making sure that all of the pieces come together cohesively. It's a lot. And I totally get, particularly if you're writing something that isn't even necessarily simple, that it's complex. It's got lots of plot lines or multiple characters who you're using as narrators. It gets complicated very quickly because novels don't work when they feel complicated. Complex is great, as this is something I've talked about on my website, helping writers become authors recently, or in the last year or so probably. But yeah, you don't want your novel to feel complicated. All of those many pieces have to come together in the end, and readers have to feel like, yes, this all makes sense. It's all part of a whole. So it is important to figure out how to manage that within your own mind so that you are able to organize them and kind of braid all the pieces down until you get to the climax. So there's multiple different ways that you can do this. I think first of all, I'll just speak to, I think sometimes people ask this question in regards to how much stuff can I put in the novel? Like, how do I know when I've put enough stuff in? And I think that ultimately that's a very subjective question based on your story and its needs. But I do think that one of the easiest or one of the simplest and most important ways to analyze whether or not you have enough stuff in your novel is simply to really examine your structural through line. What do you want this story to be about? What do the main structural beats, the skeleton of the plot, tell you that it's about? And then you can kind of weigh all the many little pieces that you may have come up with against that. Does this piece contribute to that plot skeleton? Is it moving it forward in a way that matters? Is it adding to the theme in a way that is cohesive? And if it's not, it may not be something that is actually the best choice for this story. And on the other side of that spectrum would be, maybe I don't have enough stuff. And so looking at your structural through line can help you analyze, what do I still need? What do I need to really bring this alive? And of course, you can retrofit this. So if you're not necessarily working from a structural outline in the beginning, or you don't know what it is in the beginning, because ultimately none of us completely know it in the beginning, even if what you're engineering is the outline, you still don't know until you've, worked it through and created it and then gone back and examined what you have. So you can do that as well with this, is just like put it all out there, throw it out there, and then pick out the pieces and say, okay, this is my first plot point, this is my midpoint, and where does everything else fit? And when I do this, when I'm outlining, inevitably there are pieces that do not fit and that I have to really weigh against the overall effect that I'm trying to create and, kill some of those darlings if they're not ultimately contributing to the greater darling, which is, what I hope will always be a good novel in the end. But as for the practical aspect of organizing all of your ideas and your notes and so forth, I think a good piece of software will help you, and there's many out there now. I still use Scrivener. I really like Scrivener. It's in itself is a complex tool with a little bit of a learning curve, but only because it offers so many options for organizing your stuff, your folders of research. You can subdivide scenes and things. So I use that heavily in the outlining phase, and again, obviously in the drafting phase, to just kind of bring order to what I'm doing. And I've written about this on my site as well. There's an article about how I use Scrivener to outline, that talks specifically about how I organize my information when I'm writing a book and how Scrivener helps me do that. But I think too, ultimately, you need to have the ability to reference and access stuff that you have created along the way. But I personally find, like, if I don't remember something, like if I don't remember creating it, I may not remember to go look for it in my neatly organized notes. It doesn't really matter or do me that much good. So I think the real key is, how do you organize it in your own head? And obviously that's subjective to some degree as well, but I use several different tricks to help me with this. And one is just constantly reviewing and reorganizing the material. For instance, I'm in the outlining phase right now, and every time I kind of just feel like I've reached a point where I'm not even sure what's in my notes anymore, I will stop, because I write my outlines longhand. So I will stop, I will transcribe them into Scrivener, and then I'll go over everything and just kind of reorganize it and say, okay, that idea that I came up with 2 months ago, that's passé now. I've worked around it, I've evolved past it, I've answered this question, whatever the case may be. So that kind of just helps me keep really fresh with what I'm doing. And I will do that as well during the drafting process, where I will make it a point to review outline notes, research notes every day, so that I'm, just keeping on top of like where I'm wanting to go with this story, what's the big picture, so that I don't get totally lost in the minutiae. And another trick that I use when I'm drafting is something that I call the 50,000 word edit. And this was a trick I think I got from James Scott Bell back in the day. I think he calls it something different. But basically what it is, and I don't necessarily go strictly by 50,000 words anymore, but I will stop at periods throughout the story, at least every quarter of the story, and reread the whole thing as I'm writing it, so that I don't kind of lose the forest for the trees, and I can try to keep that big picture in my head as much as possible. So yeah, it's tough to try to keep all of your thoughts and your notes organized, and to like have your eye on the big picture, because sometimes we don't even know what the big picture is in the beginning. But to keep your eye on that as it's emerging and evolving, and then still keeping pace with all the little details that will make up that big picture. So hopefully some of these ideas are helpful, or at least reassuring that it's just part of the game, so to speak. So if you enjoyed this video, then I hope that you will participate in some way. If you'd like to have your question answered next week, please leave it as a comment down below. And I would totally appreciate it if you would consider interacting with the video in some way, whether it's liking it or leaving a comment, just to let YouTube's algorithm know that you liked it. And of course, I always am so incredibly appreciative of anyone who takes the time to buy a book or support me on Patreon. So thank you very much. And I will see you next week.